From the air, Betio looked too small to survive a map. 2 miles of coral, 500 yards across at its widest point, no ground higher than a 2-story house. And in September of 1943, the Japanese admiral ordered to defend it told his men something that sounded insane. He said it would take 1 million Americans and 100 years to capture that island. 76 hours after the first Marine stepped off a landing craft into the lagoon, Betio was in American hands. But that number, 76 hours, hides the real story. Because Tarawa was not simply a battle between Marines and bunkers. It was a battle between confidence and water. The Japanese commander believed the island could not fall. The American commanders believed their ships could break it open. They believed the tide would rise. They believed the radios would work. They believed the Reef would let the war come ashore. The Reef did not. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki was 49 when he arrived on Betio. He was not a wild-eyed myth-maker. He was a naval officer, a graduate of the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy, a man who had seen amphibious landings in China from the attacking side and understood the ugly geometry of men trying to reach a defended beach. He understood the bottleneck, boats slowing down, men packed shoulder to shoulder, a flat approach with nowhere to hide, water deep enough to slow a body but shallow enough to keep that body exposed. So he did not design Betio like an island to be defended from the center. He designed it like a trap that began before the beach. By the time he took command, much of the work had already been done. Japanese troops, construction units, and more than 1,000 Korean laborers had spent month after month turning a coral strip into a machine for stopping men in the lagoon. 500 pillboxes, coastal guns under reinforced concrete, heavy machine guns sighted to cross each other's fire, barbed wire along the reef, mines, trenches linking positions so defenders could move without showing themselves, concrete, coconut logs, sand-filled steel plate. Materials chosen because they did not shatter the way planners hoped they would. From above, Betio was a smear of sand. From the lagoon, it was a wall with guns inside it. And most of the men forced to build that wall were Koreans who had not chosen the war, the island, or the empire using their hands. History often counts them at the edge of the story. It should not. They helped build the fortress. Most of them died inside it. The American reason for taking Betio was cold and strategic. The United States wanted the Marianas. To reach the Marianas, it needed the Marshalls. To reach the Marshalls cleanly, it needed to remove the Japanese airfield and garrison in the Gilberts. The chain ran west across the Pacific, and Betio was one of the locks on that chain. The 2nd Marine Division got the assignment. These were Guadalcanal veterans. Men who already knew the smell of rot, fever, fear, and jungle rain. But Betio was not Guadalcanal. It was smaller, flatter, cleaner to describe on paper, and much more dangerous than it looked. The assault plan rested on 3 beliefs. First, the naval bombardment would smash the defenses. Second, the November tide would be high enough for landing craft to cross the reef. Third, command and communications would hold together once the shooting started. All 3 beliefs were fragile. One man saw the second one clearly. His name was Frank Holland. He was a New Zealand reservist who had spent years sailing around Tarawa before the war. He knew the lagoon the way a man knows the road home, and he warned the planners that the November neap tide could betray them. The Higgins boats needed roughly 5 feet of water. The Reef might give them 3. If that happened, the boats would stop short. The Marines would have to climb out, and the last 200 yards would not be a landing. It would be a walk through gunfire. The warning was heard. It was not obeyed enough. Lieutenant General Holland Smith fought for more LVTs, the amphibious tractors that could crawl over coral regardless of the tide. He got some, he did not get enough. A last-minute shipment of 50 newer LVT-2s arrived just before the assault. Those machines would later become the difference between men who crossed the reef inside armor and men who had to step into the lagoon and hope the water did not swallow their ammunition. The plan itself had been shaped by Colonel David M. Shoup, a tough Marine from Indiana, precise, stubborn, and deeply aware of what the operation required. Days before the landing, his regimental commander broke under the strain. Shoup was promoted and given the regiment. The man who had helped write the assault plan now had to execute it under fire. There was another weakness no one had fully solved: the flagship's own guns. When the battleship Maryland fired her main battery, the concussion knocked radios out of alignment and wrecked parts of the communications net. That mattered because an amphibious assault is not one event. It is dozens of events that have to remain connected. Boats, tanks, fire support, command posts, reserve waves, wounded men, requests for help. A beach battle can become chaos in minutes. And at Tarawa, the machines meant to connect the chaos were already vulnerable before the first landing craft touched water. At dawn on November 20th, 1943, the fleet opened fire. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft poured metal and explosives onto a target so small it seemed impossible anything could live on it. Smoke rose until Betio disappeared. From offshore, it looked like the island was being erased. The promise was simple. The Navy would crush the beach. The Marines would land on wreckage. But the bunkers had been built for this. Shells tore up sand. They cut palms apart. They blasted open exposed positions. But many of the pillboxes held. The guns inside them waited. Then, because the Marines were coming in, the bombardment had to stop. It could not keep firing into the landing waves. For roughly 40 minutes, the island breathed. And in that pause, Japanese defenders moved back into lagoon-facing positions. Machine guns were remanned, sights were reset. Weapons were trained on the same water Shibazaki had studied. The bombardment had not failed because it did nothing. It failed because it did not do enough. And when the smoke thinned, the lagoon was still a killing ground. The Higgins boats came in. They were supposed to ride over the reef and deliver Marines close to shore. Instead, the reef stopped them. Coral scraped hulls, engines churned, ramps dropped into water that should have been passable. The tide had not risen. Frank Holland's warning had become the battlefield. 200 yards from the beach, men faced a choice that was no choice at all. Stay in the boats and die in place, or go over the side. They went over. The water came to the chest, sometimes higher. Ammunition pulled men down. Rifle belts dragged against coral. Some stepped into hidden holes and disappeared. The coral underfoot was sharp enough to cut through boots, and from the shore, machine guns began stitching the lagoon. The Japanese fire did not come from one point. It came from angles, from pillboxes whose arcs overlapped, from weapons placed for this exact moment, aimed at this exact stretch of water, waiting for men moving too slowly to sprint and too exposed to hide. The Marines were not storming a beach. They were crossing a firing range. The first waves were torn apart. Some men fell halfway in. Some made it close enough to see the seawall and then dropped forward into the water. Many who reached dry coral were already wounded. The LVTs did what the boats could not. They crawled over the reef. They carried Marines past the water trap. But there were not enough of them, and the ones that survived the crossing were chewed up by guns, mines, and artillery. By the end of the battle, the amphibian tractor battalion had lost most of its vehicles and more than half its men. That is what 3 feet of water decided. Somewhere amid the smoke and surf, a message got through to the ships. Landed. Heavy opposition. Casualties catastrophic. Cannot hold. Then the battle removed the Japanese commander. In the afternoon, Shibazaki and senior officers moved in the open toward another command post. A Navy destroyer fired a 5-inch salvo. Airbursts caught the group. Shibazaki was killed on the first day. The man who believed Betio could resist 1,000,000 men never saw whether his fortress would hold. He did not die in a final duel. He did not watch the last bunker fall. A shell found him in the open, and command passed into fragments. That mattered. The Japanese garrison continued to fight with terrible discipline. But the coordinated counterattack that might have thrown the Marines back into the sea never came with the force it could have had. By nightfall, roughly 5,000 Marines were on or near Betio. About 1,500 were dead or wounded. The beachhead was not a beachhead in the way planners imagined. It was a thin, bloody hold on the edge of the island. Colonel Shoup set his command post against the landward side of a Japanese bunker. The bunker was still occupied on the other side. He was wounded. He was filthy. He would not leave. He would not sit down. Behind him, men tried to pass ammunition forward and wounded men backward, through a strip of ground too small for either task. Offshore, Major General Julian Smith sat aboard the Maryland with broken information. Radio static, partial reports, rumors passed from one channel to another. Every time the flagship's guns fired, the communications problem got worse. The commander who had sent thousands of Marines into Betio did not know what the beach looked like. He did not know whether Shoup was alive. He did not know whether the first day had failed. On the island, no one had the luxury of that question. They were still inside it. The second day changed the arithmetic. On the western end of Betio, at Green Beach, Major Michael Ryan found room to move. His Marines got a foothold. Ryan made contact with destroyers offshore and began calling fire onto Japanese positions that were stopping his men. This was what the first day had promised and failed to deliver. Not blind destruction. Fire connected to the men who needed it. Shells hit pillboxes. Marines advanced. One position at a time, the edge of the island began to loosen. By the end of November 21st, Green Beach was in American hands. Reinforcements could come ashore there. Artillery observers began doing their work. The same island that had been a wall on the first morning started to show seams. But nothing about it became easy. The tide was still wrong. The dead were still in the water. The wounded still waited. And the men on the beach still did not know how much force remained in front of them. At 4 in the afternoon on November 21st, 36 hours after Marines first hit the reef, Shoup sent a situation report from his bunkerside command post. He had every reason to sound broken. He did not. The report ended with 5 words. Combat efficiency. We are winning. Those words reached Julian Smith aboard the Maryland, and for the first time, The commander offshore knew the island had not swallowed the assault whole. The beach would hold. That same evening, from the Japanese side, a final message went to Tokyo. Their weapons were being destroyed. Everyone was preparing for a final charge. It ended with the old imperial promise that Japan should exist for 10,000 years. It was not a report of victory. It was a farewell sent through a collapsing defense. The men transmitting it had been told the island could not fall. By then, many of them knew it already had. On the third day, the tide finally rose. The Higgins boats reached the beach the way they were supposed to on the first morning. More tanks came ashore. Marine infantry pushed east across the island and along the airstrip. The battle became slower, closer, more methodical. Bunkers had to be burned out or blasted open. Tanks crawled forward with infantry around them. Riflemen, flamethrower teams, demolition men, and naval gunfire all moved in a brutal sequence across ground no one could afford to leave behind. The Japanese defenders fought from holes, trenches, and concrete until they were overrun or killed. On the night of November 22nd into the morning of the 23rd, the last organized resistance broke into a final banzai charge. By dawn, the shape of the battle had changed again. There were still men fighting. There was no longer a defense that could save the island. At 1:30 in the afternoon on November 23, 1943, Betio was declared secure. The battle had lasted 76 hours. Nearly 6,000 men were dead on a coral island smaller than many city parks. Of the Japanese garrison, only a handful survived. Of the Korean laborers forced onto the island, only a fraction lived. More than 1,000 Americans had been killed. Thousands more were wounded. And the ground gave the living almost no time to mourn. The heat came back. Bodies lay in the sun. Burials were fast. Tank ditches became graves. Bulldozers moved coral over men whose names would later be lost under reorganized markers and wartime confusion. The Seabees went to work on the airstrip. War does that. It turns a battlefield into a job site before grief is finished speaking. Staff Sergeant Norman Hatch had filmed the battle from the beginning. His cameras recorded what victory looked like when the smoke cleared. American dead in the lagoon, bodies beside the seawall, faces the public was not used to seeing. The footage was so severe that its release went all the way to President Franklin Roosevelt. He approved it. For many Americans, Tarawa was the first time the Pacific War arrived not as a headline, but as bodies. The backlash came fast. Families wrote to Admiral Nimitz. General Douglas MacArthur called the assault a tragic and unnecessary massacre. Holland Smith, who had fought for more LVTs before the battle, walked the beach afterward and compared the losses to Pickett's charge. The question was not whether Betio had been taken. It had. The question was whether the price had been madness. Nimitz answered with the logic of the campaign. Tarawa, he said in effect, had broken open the front door of the Central Pacific defenses. 10 weeks later, the Marshall's campaign began. Planes flew from the airfield on Betio, renamed Hawkins Field for a Marine officer killed there, and supported the next landings. The chain that required Tarawa to fall did move. But it moved over the bodies of men who had been told the bombardment would clear the way and the tide would rise. What changed after Tarawa was written in practical terms. Underwater demolition teams were created so future assault forces would not approach unknown reefs blind. Those teams would become predecessors of the Navy's SEALs. LVTs were improved with armor and radios. Ship-to-shore fire coordination was rebuilt. Communications planning had to account for the shock of a battleship firing its own guns. Tarawa taught lessons the American command should never have needed to learn at that price. But war often teaches only after the bill has been paid, and the island did not pay only in uniformed dead. The Gilbertese people returned to a home that had been transformed into a military scar. Trees cut down, lagoon waters mined and disturbed, fishing grounds damaged. A subsistence world broken by a battle fought over strategic lines drawn elsewhere. No victory parade repaired that. No campaign map showed what had been taken from them. Then there were the Americans who did not come home because no one could find them. In the rush to bury the dead and build the runway, markers were moved, cemeteries were rearranged. Some graves became memorials without bodies beneath them. Some bodies remained under coral, under construction, under the new shape of the island. Decades later, teams returned with ground-penetrating radar. They came back because the battle had not finished giving up its dead. One of the men found was Marine Sergeant Robert F. Van Heck of Chicago. He was 25. His family received a letter from him around Christmas of 1943. He warned them not to count on him coming home that spring. About half an hour later, the telegram arrived. He had died at Tarawa. More than 80 years later, he was buried in Illinois. A life interrupted in the lagoon finally reached home soil. That is what 76 hours can become. Not just a battle, not just a chapter in Amphibious doctrine, a reef in the Central Pacific, a tide that did not rise, a commander killed before he could know whether he was right, a colonel standing wounded against an enemy bunker and refusing to leave. A film America almost did not see. An airfield built over confusion and graves. Families waiting across generations for one name to come back. Betio is still low, still narrow, still ringed by bright water. From above, it can still look harmless, a pale strip in a turquoise lagoon. But maps are good at hiding what water remembers. The island fell in 76 hours. The reef is still giving back the names.